The ancient Egyptians were a culture far ahead of their time. Every society that came into contact with a civilization centered on the Nile River learned something of value that helped evolve their own culture. But that doesn't mean they excelled in every facet of society. Just like in our modern era, this nation still had a pretty noticeable gap between the rich and the poor. Upper-class Egyptians were obsessed with looking their best and ensuring they had a good level of personal hygiene, an act they believed pleased their gods. While you'd then assume that everyone's hygiene was far beyond that of neighboring countries, you might be shocked to find out that it was for the lower classes who had to bathe in sewage water accompanied by deadly animals. It was actually quite gruesome. Join us on this journey as we explore some of the most unusual and downright disgusting aspects of ancient Egyptian hygiene. From washing laundry in the polluted Nile River alongside crocodiles to infestations that would drive us crazy in the modern era. This is the incredible and downright disturbing hygiene practices of ancient Egypt. Stick around, as this is one video you won't want to miss. Ancient cosmetics in Dynastic-era Egypt. If you know anything about the history of ancient Egypt, then for sure you've heard about the advancements they made in writing and architecture. But did you know they were the masterminds behind the inventions that we still use today, including toothpaste and makeup? This may have given you the impression that everything was perfect during the golden era of dynastic Egyptian society, but this isn't necessarily the case. For the lower classes living alongside the Nile River, they didn't have all the same conveniences as the wealthy, and so some of their personal hygiene was actually quite horrid. But before we dive into the nasty and disgusting hygienic practices, we feel it's best to at least first mention the pleasant hygiene that existed. As to many researchers, this outbalances the Nile civilization's nasty practices. In ancient Egyptian society, class often determined a lot of the conveniences they'd have in their everyday life. The rich had an obsession with looking good during this era and would adorn vast swathes of gold, wigs, and beautifully handmade clothes and the latest perfumes. To be wealthy in ancient Egypt was to live amongst the 1%. The Egyptians were deeply fascinated with looking their best and would enhance their natural beauty using various organic and homemade cosmetic products. Often credited with inventing the first form of makeup, the Egyptians were well ahead of their time in the cosmetic department. They began using an organic eyeliner known as kohl over 6,000 years ago. It was made by mixing together various ingredients such as oxidized copper, charred almonds, ash powder, lead, and a few other minor ingredients before being mixed with oil. This produced a thick cream that would be applied in much the same way of a modern eyeliner. The kohl was seen as a way to enhance the natural beauty of the eyes and give them a slightly oval shape. But it also protected their eyes from the harsh African sun. Alongside the invention of eyeliner, the Egyptians were among the first to use their own makeup. Various blends would have been handmade in a similar way to the eyeliner. One popular form of makeup was made from a mixture of copper and lead ores. Another, known as malachite, was made from copper minerals and formed a bright green paste. Both makeup products were used to add color and definition to the face. Just before we continue, if you're enjoying this video on the hygienic practices of ancient Egypt and would like to see more videos like this, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. The Egyptians' fascination with hygiene. So, while it goes without saying, considering how important personal appearance was to the higher classes of Egyptian society, you can only imagine their infatuation with personal hygiene. The fertile banks along the Nile were scorching hot year-round, ultimately leading to a lot of sweating. As the Egyptians were obsessed with staying clean and free from a horrid stench, many of them would have bathed at least twice per day. An artisanal soap was made from a mixture of various ingredients, such as beeswax, natron, and water. Just like various other facets of Egyptian life, bathing was seen as a ritual that pleased the gods. According to texts, bathing first thing every morning would result in protection from the gods. But the second most important time of the day to bathe was in the evening before one settled down for their final meal. If you were super rich during these ancient times, you would even have access to a bathhouse where you could bathe in a hot stream accompanied by aromatic natural oils. Yes, even in ancient Egypt, they knew about the benefits of aromatherapy, and the upper class loved it. When it came to staying fresh throughout the day, the Egyptians used an assortment of perfumes that would fill the air with sweet aromas. Natural deodorants would also be employed to ensure the harsh body odor is kept at bay during the hottest and sweatiest parts of the day. One interesting recipe used in the production of such deodorant is preserved in the Harsht Papyrus document. The text recommends mixing incense, myrrh, the leaves of lettuce, and a mysterious ingredient before rubbing it on your armpits. The world's first toothbrush. Our last fact centered on Egyptian hygiene may surprise you, but did you know the Dynastic people are actually credited with the invention of toothbrushes? Yes, that's right. Egyptian moms over 5,000 years ago may have been as strict as your mother when it came to brushing your teeth before school. They were fashioned from twigs and used small strips of dried papyrus as bristles. Quite the invention. Toothpaste was also a common commodity in every rich household, and had been for thousands of years before the invention of the toothbrush. A mixture of rock, salt, mint, pepper, and the dried leaves of the iris flower formed the foundation of the toothpaste. No doubt, this would have been used several times daily. But this wasn't all. The Egyptians hated the idea of bad breath so much that they even invented their own specific kinds of mints that would be carried with them throughout the day. While herbs like parsley could be chewed on to provide one with a sweet-smelling breath, fragrant spices were combined with herbs and mixed with honey to form tiny mints that could be sucked on when one was feeling insecure about their breath. As you can see, there was an extreme desire for much of the upper class to appear aesthetically perfect in every regard, including personal hygiene. But this wasn't all just to do with looking good. For many, it was intertwined with their strong spiritual beliefs. You see, the upper class in ancient Egypt didn't have to worry about that much, so they had more time to explore their religious beliefs. The daily rituals they followed rigorously, including bathing, looking good, smelling great, and ensuring personal hygiene was up to scratch, all stem from a paragraph in the revered Book of the Dead. It claims that if you did not uphold your level of personal hygiene or make an effort to look your best, you couldn't speak in the afterlife. So ultimately, a vast portion of the dynastic Egyptian population followed these rules, as who wouldn't want to talk in the afterlife? But this wasn't the case for everyone. While still religious, the bottom tier of society in ancient Egypt didn't have all day to sit around and try to look beautiful in the hope of impressing their gods. Instead, they would have to make do with what they had. And unfortunately, that wasn't much. They didn't have a private bath, nor fancy makeup, and certainly no golden jewelry. When it came to their personal hygiene, things actually got a little disgusting simply because they had no other option. The nasty side of hygiene in ancient Egypt. Even in a society as grand as ancient Egypt, the lower class still suffered just like anywhere else in the world. They didn't have the money to enjoy the luxurious cosmetic products that the rich did, nor did they have a bath in their home to clean themselves. Ultimately, this led to a lot of unsanitary and disgusting hygienic practices, as the lower classes simply had no other option. When it came to using the bathroom, of course, the homes of the wealthy had a beautifully made limestone toilet and a base made of wood. It would have worked in a similar fashion to a compost toilet. But this meant that some unlucky servant had the horrible job of emptying the base once it filled up. However, the lower class had no such convenience. I think you can already see where this is going. Every time they needed to use the bathroom, they would take a walk somewhere nice and quiet and simply dig a small hole in the ground. If you think this is bad, some of the residents who lived closest to the banks of the Nile would actually use the river as their personal restroom, even though a family could be swimming downstream. This led to the pollution of various parts of the Great River, as since the Egyptians used the Nile as their primary source of water for drinking, cooking, and washing clothes, they would, unfortunately, be using water infused with someone's lunch from yesterday. Yikes. It certainly sounds horrid when we put it like that, doesn't it? This significantly contributed to the spread of certain parasites and waterborne illnesses. But the worst part may in fact remind you of how the rich act even in modern times. While the upper class was so dedicated to looking their best and feeling the same, they didn't care what it cost to do so. As their toilets had to be emptied, the most obvious place to dump the waste was the beautiful flowing river that sat a short distance from their home. So the servants would gather up all the sewage in buckets and dump it in streams that ran into the Nile, or simply dump it straight into the sacred river. But if they lived further away, the servants would have no choice but to dump the horrific sewage in the surrounding fields. Ultimately, this would later ground into the ground where various crops were grown. The dumping of feces and remains into the Nile and fields certainly has led to multiple diseases. This would have included diarrhea, E. coli, and even hepatitis A, alongside various sicknesses derived from parasites and bacteria. This further added to the poor quality of life the lowest classes endured during ancient times in Egypt. Some of these people would have even died from the continuous use of the invested Nile water for drinking and cleaning. When it came to washing their clothes, yep, you got it, it would also be done in the same water that was full of toilet excrement and harmful bacteria. As the centuries rolled by in the Dynastic era, wardrobes became more fashionable and long garments were donned during social events. All of this had to be cleaned, and whether you were rich or poor, you had to wash your clothes in the polluted river. But if you think washing clothes in the infested river was bad, they also had to bathe in the water. A vast number of households in ancient Egypt, regardless of class, had some kind of bucket and jug for daily washing. But sometimes, people had no other option than to bathe in the Nile. While you may think it was a time before real pollution, as we have already explained, this was not the case. So those bathing in the worst parts of the river would have for sure contracted some kind of parasite or sickness from time to time. By today's standards, it would seem to be horribly unsanitary, but also rather dangerous, considering at any moment, a crocodile or hippo could surface from beneath the murky water and send you on your way to meet the gods. The reason all Egyptians shaved their heads. We've covered just how downright disgusting some aspects of Egyptian hygiene could have been for the lower classes, and it's funny how things haven't changed in our modern times. The rich of Egypt had all the luxurious money they could buy, whereas the poor had to make do with what they could make for themselves. This even spilled over into the wearing of wigs. But you might be asking yourself, well, what does that have to do with hygiene? Let's find out. All classes of ancient Egyptian society regularly shaved their heads, but they did not roam the streets of their nation showing off their bald heads. Instead, the wealthy inhabitants of Egypt had an assortment of wigs that they would wear on various occasions. One style may be used during a family event, while another is better suited to a social gathering full of friends. The wigs served two functions to the culture. They provided the rich with a level of comfort in Africa's harsh climate and protected them against the spread of head lice. However, for our citizens of the lower class who couldn't afford wigs, they had to make do with cheap fabrics wrapped around their heads. But unfortunately, this led to a reduction in the level of personal hygiene. One of the worst was the spread of head lice. These tiny bugs would torment the lives of Egyptians in various communities. Men, women, and children would often shave their heads to reduce the spread of these horrible critters. To do so, they'd use anything from knives to tweezers, with the fortunate ones having some kind of razor. Yet despite all the attempts made, no class of Egypt was entirely able to avoid the spread of head lice, nor could the dead. According to some researchers, even a portion of Egyptian mummies recovered from various burial tombs even had lice at the time of their passing. So while the ancient Egyptians were well ahead of other primitive cultures in terms of personal hygiene and cosmetics, it doesn't mean everyone got to live such a luxurious life. Just like every other society of the Old World, the upper class had many more opportunities to live a clean and healthy life, yet the lower class had to make do with what they had, even if this meant bathing and drinking from the sewage-infested Nile. And that's our video on the incredible and downright disgusting hygiene of ancient Egypt. Did you know that the Egyptians have so many of the cosmetic products that we still use today? And do you think you'd try any of their artisanal products if they were available in our modern times? Did you know there was such a gap between the hygiene of the upper and lower classes? Let us know all your thoughts in the comments section below. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more exciting videos centered on the history of illness and how it shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.